right, hello everyone. Welcome to your first guided lecture of AP Euro. I know it's a very exciting moment for all involved. Um, right off the bat, we're going to cover the Renaissance. My hope is that your summer work um, helped fill in all of the gaps that existed in your prior knowledge of what the Renaissance was. We don't really talk about the Renaissance in world history too much. It's a little bit earlier than where we tend to start the course in ninth grade, so perhaps you guys needed more than a refresher on the Renaissance, and that's why I've also put together this PowerPoint in the hopes of really clarifying everything with the Renaissance. It's an important period in AP Euro because it sets the stage for a lot to come. And yeah, that's about all I got. So let's get started here. So we'll do causes and we'll do effects at the end, of course. Causes and effects, causation, one of the historical thinking skills for AP Euro. So we tend to do that a lot. So reasons for the Renaissance, this is all up for debate. And we're going to talk about at the end of this PowerPoint the fact that we don't even know as a historical community whether we should speak of a Renaissance, the Renaissance. And so when we're talking about causes of the Renaissance, there's debate on those as well. What we know is that in the 14th century, there's a couple of really big changes that occur, primarily in Europe, but we'll see that they're global in scope, that lead to some pretty massive changes from what was happening in the high Middle Ages. So the Black Death comes to Europe in 1347. It arrives via merchants on trading ships, probably from Asia, the Middle East, and it spreads across Europe very quickly. We'll talk about the ramifications of that as we go on. Around the same time, a really important concept in AP Euro is humanism, and humanism begins to emerge. This idea that the study of man, which is a stand-in for humanity, is important. Just studying humanity and humans for what they are, really separating out the study of knowledge through the lens of religion. And we'll talk about humanism a lot in the course. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 and the destruction of the Byzantine Empire. So this leads to a migration of Greek scholars to Italy, and it also leads to this great anxiety in Europe that they are falling behind, air quotes around behind, specifically the Ottomans, but just like the Islamic world in general. And so that's also going to add fuel to the fire of revival, of wanting to better, again, air quotes around that, European society and culture. The Medici family in Florence, a very unique family. They are great patrons of the arts. Some of the great Renaissance art that we get in the late 15th and early 16th centuries that you all know and will recognize is paid for by the Medici family. They just loved culture and the arts, and they had a lot of money. They were also extremely powerful politically. They basically ran Florence. They helped to install popes and remove popes from power. They were hugely influential. And so we can't talk about the Renaissance, specifically the Italian Renaissance, without talking about the Medici family. And as already mentioned, money is a big part of this. Northern Italy is the gateway for the Crusades. Southern Italy is a major trading area. These Italian city-states have been growing fairly wealthy over the last couple centuries leading up to the 1400s due to their location on the Mediterranean and their ability to trade. And so, money, big part of the Renaissance. And we're also going to talk about artistic changes which are brought on by the Renaissance. This is a part of AP Euro. It's not really in the other two AP history classes, but it's definitely a part of AP Euro. So we're going to talk about the use of perspective and the focus on the individual. This pairs well with the emergence of humanism. Up here, we see this in what Renaissance art looks like and how it contrasts to medieval art as well. And so, yeah, the focus on the individual there is going to be key as well. So when we're talking about causation for the Renaissance, you should know all of these and be able to call on all of these if need be. So why Italy? Kind of already mentioned this in the last slide. The Crusades made the Italian city-states quite wealthy. The Crusades are these religious excursions into the Islamic world that are perpetuated by the popes, the Catholic popes, in the 11th century and onward. And these Christian crusaders go to the Islamic lands and just pillage them. And they take lots of stuff out of the Islamic lands. They also kill lots of people and destroy lots of towns and villages. These are very bloody affairs. But when we're talking about the Renaissance, the significance is the loot that these crusaders come back from the Islamic world with. The Islamic world also is really the center of knowledge and understanding at this time. When we're talking about the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, the Islamic world is a vibrant, scientific culture and community. And so the Italian city-states don't just grow wealthy in terms of money, but they also grow wealthy in terms of the knowledge that they are bringing back with them from the Islamic world. Mention this as well when we look on the map. Of course, strategic location to control trade to Asia and the Middle East, trade that is flowing from places like France, Northern Europe, into places like Asia and the Middle East, and vice versa. So, of course, that's helping with the wealth of Italy. Bankers are loaning money to governments and churches to hire artists. Best example of this is Florence with the Medici, but that is helping with the accumulation of wealth. Now, historically, in Europe, wealth had been accumulated primarily by the church, and that's still going to continue. But now we're starting to see the emergence of these very wealthy families who are connected to the church, but their wealth is not as connected to the church. And this wealth is flaunted. This wealth becomes appealing to a lot of people, and it also leads to a lot of wealthy people turning away from the religious life. So it's not to say that we have an anti-religious movement. It's far too early for that. But there is this belief that begins to spread that a world without God may, in fact, be a better world. It frees up people to live their lives as they want to live their life, and they don't have to worry about all of these very strict religious rules and laws and concepts that they have to follow. I don't want to overstate this. The Renaissance is still a Christian movement in many ways, and it's not really until we get to the modern era that people really start to challenge religion directly, but it has its roots in the Renaissance, this challenge to religion and to Christianity in particular. So humanism is an intellectual movement focusing on the study of human beings. The humanities is a term which maybe you've heard before, but the humanities as an educational concept is things like history, English, philosophy. These are all considered the humanities, studying human beings for what they are. During the Renaissance, people are going to use ancient Greece and ancient Rome to create an understanding of the present. There's this view that is somewhat problematic, but is also kind of useful for us in AP Euro, of these great Renaissance thinkers rediscovering a lot of the work done by the ancient Greco-Roman philosophers, primarily Grecian philosophers, And like I said, that's sort of problematic because it's not like this knowledge just went away for 2,000 years and then popped up again. But to some extent, it did. People like this guy over here, Petrarch, who I'll talk about a little more in a moment. He is discovering manuscripts that had, for all intents and purposes, been lost to European culture. He is translating them. He is helping to disseminate the knowledge. And so this ancient Greek and, to lesser extent, Roman knowledge that had been forgotten by Europe for a long time is all of a sudden found again and integrated into society. Humanism is a response to a standard program of education. So the focus is seeing in humans the purpose of God's creation. This idea that God created human beings to have agency and to do what they wanted to do. God didn't create humans just to genuflect and to praise him constantly, and in all that they did, make sure that it was related to God. The humanists believe that God created humans to live their lives freely. This is a direct challenge, an indirect challenge, I should say, to the place of the church. And so for the humanists, they say that the challenge of every human being is to define their place in God's plan. And so this brings up some really great philosophical questions, and I mean a capital G, meaning significant. So the church, the Christian church, had always answered these two questions: what is the purpose in life and why am I here? With God. The purpose of life is to praise God, to worship God, and you are here by the grace of God. The humanists challenge this, and they say that secular achievements can be a part of God's plan. And so this is why I say this is an indirect challenge to religion. The humanists are not saying that religion is bad and religion needs to go away and God doesn't exist. I mean, that stuff is hundreds of years in the future in Europe, in European thought. What the humanists instead are saying is that secular achievements by humans, can be integrated into an authentic relationship with God. For example, let's say I make a lot of money as an Italian merchant. This is a secular achievement, and this does not mean that I am not a godly person, because God has given me the gifts that I have used to become wealthy. And so we must use this potential, and this is a way to honor him. This is very different than what the Catholic Church had been preaching. And so it is an indirect challenge to the role of the church and the role of God in everyday life. So that's humanism, and that's the humanists. And Petrarch is referred to as the father of the Renaissance because this humanist thought is what's going to underpin a lot of the changes that are going to come in the late 1400s and early 1500s, where the humanists, I should say, where the Renaissance thinkers and artists and philosophers are going to look at the world around them from a distinctly secular perspective, celebrating human beings and human society for what it is on this earth, not godly. Okay, around the same time that Petrarch is living and he is rediscovering these lost manuscripts and beginning to, he doesn't create humanist thought, but beginning that process that leads to the creation of humanist thought, we have this cataclysmic event in Europe, which is the Black Death. And I'll go through this pretty quickly because I think most of you have heard of this before. It's a pandemic. Well, there's a word you've heard before. It is pretty quick in terms of the length of time. You can see on this map here that it starts really down around the Mediterranean in 1347 and spreads quickly outwards from there. And by 1351, the plague has pretty much spread all across Western, Central, and Eastern Europe. I always get the question about like why aren't there major outbreaks in these areas? To be quite honest, I'm not sure, but my guess is geography as well as demographics. The geography probably leads to lower instances of the spread, and also like the number of people who are living here, how they are interacting with other people, the environment, all those sorts of things. But feel free to do some research on your own. It's not really a concern of ours. The major concern is that the plague wipes out between a third and 2/3 of Europe's population. It's probably closer to a third, but that's major, of course. And when we're talking about the total world death toll, something like 75 million people are killed in this plague. Millions of Europeans are killed. Now, as you guys are distinctly aware from living through COVID-19, COVID-19 is a pandemic that is orders of magnitude lower than the Black Death. But you can see just how COVID-19 has impacted society, global society, American society, in New Jersey society, and society in Hopewell and Pennington. And so if you consider how much COVID-19 has changed our world and affected the way that we live, the way that we think, the actions that we take, imagine a pandemic like the Black Death and how this would affect people's lives. And also consider that people didn't really know what was going on. We understand COVID-19. We understand the pandemic in ways that Europeans in the 14th century couldn't have hoped to understand. We know now that the Black Death was spread by fleas and rats, and so the Black Death probably came to Europe on trading ships, on merchant ships that are arriving from the Middle East and from Asia, and it is spreading very quickly from there. So yeah, there's that. Spreads rapidly across Europe. I already mentioned that. So examples: Florence, population in 1338 is 120,000. Florence is one of the most vibrant areas of Europe in the High Middle Ages. And just 13 years later, that population is down to 50,000. A lot of that is due to death. Some of that is due to people fleeing the cities, because cities were the epicenters for the spread of the Black Death. As we know, again, from living through a pandemic, pandemics spread much more easily where people are concentrated. Another example is England. Population roughly 7 million in 1300, population roughly 2 million in 1400. So, yeah, I already talked about this, but yeah, merchants, of course, are the ones who are bringing this and spreading this primarily. So when we talk about the effects of the Black Death, we have to consider the institutions that are affected the most. And the institution that is affected the most is the church. And this is because humans at the time, the primary way that they explained the world around them was through religion, was through God. Now all of a sudden, people are dying in large numbers, unseen and unheard of numbers. And people turn to the Catholic Church for answers. And the Catholic Church, the answer is basically, well, God is angry. You all are sinners. And so what must be done? Well, we must purge the sins. And so this leads to the rounding up of heretics. Oops, I forgot my... Close it off there. The rounding up of supposed heretics who had brought God's wrath and vengeance on these communities. So thousands of Jews are killed. Anti-Semitism is a theme throughout AP European history, and it starts very early on. Our first PowerPoint, we see this anti-Semitism that exists in Europe. Jewish communities are often blamed in European society when there is some sort of a problem that occurs. The Black Death is no different. Jews are easy targets for European Christians because they worship differently. They live in separate communities often. So they are easily identified, and they are often fairly wealthy as well. And so there's a lot of disdain for Jews by European Christians. And this is a theme, like I said, this is a thread that runs throughout European history. And the Black Death is no different. Also, there are men, especially upper class men, who believe that they need to purge themselves. And so they form these flagellants, these groups that travel town to town performing acts of penance and punishment, these very public acts of penance and punishment. They actually beat themselves and each other with these like very thick leather, think of them like belts, basically. This is flagellation. This is the act of physical punishment for your sins in the hopes that it will purge them from you and you will be viewed more positively in the eyes of God. The other reaction to this, the Black Death, however, is the opposite. Whereas some people become more devout and more religious, other people turn away from religion and believe that the church has fatally flawed. The church cannot cure, the church cannot explain the outbreak. In fact, monasteries are one of the places where the outbreak spreads very easily. And so you have this situation where church officials are dying in really high numbers. Entire monasteries are wiped out. An entire generation of clergy is lost. So there are fewer church officials. So the churches themselves have a harder time of operating, of spreading the gospel. This all points to, as far as some Europeans are concerned, as a problem with the church itself, as a problem with religion. If the church can't help us, if the church can't solve this, well, maybe the church isn't the answer. And so we start to see more secular politicians emerging after this period. The Black Death, you can think of it this way, kind of clears the way for the emergence of more secular ruling and more secular answers to problems that before the Black Death had been answered through religion. Again, I don't want to overstate this. It's not that the Black Death causes the destruction of the Catholic Church. Far from it. And you should know that. Of course, the Catholic Church is still around today. It still has hundreds of millions of followers. The Black Death, as well as things like secular humanism, are just chipping away at this total power that the Catholic Church had throughout the Middle Ages. And so we get to, finally, the Renaissance. When we're talking about a time period for the Renaissance, we want to date it like late 14th century, but really the Renaissance, we're talking about late 1400s, late 15th century into the 16th century. That is like the golden age of the Renaissance, when we're getting these really beautiful paintings and frescoes, the Sistine Chapel. All these things are like 16th century. And so you can view that as like the culmination of the Renaissance. The roots of the Renaissance are in the 14th century, but it really comes into its own in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. So what characterizes the Renaissance? Of course, it means rebirth, and it's a revival of the arts, learning, thinking. We'll talk about this in a moment when I get to the debates slide. This is sort of problematic because it encourages us as historians to view the Renaissance as a positive good, and therefore we view what came before the Middle Ages as bad, as a net bad. There needs to be a rebirth. There needs to be a revival. Why? Well, because the Middle Ages sucked. And that's just not really the case. It's lacking any nuance, which I hope you guys know at this point is the bedrock of any good historical analysis, is nuance. So yeah, if we're talking about the basic definition of the Renaissance, this is it. It's a revival of the arts and learning and thinking across Europe, and that is true. But I caution you against viewing the Renaissance as this like explosion. Perhaps it was not a revolution. Perhaps it is just more of an evolution. So yeah, Also transitioning from a spiritual world to a secular one. Again, we don't want to overstate that. The world is still very much spiritual throughout the Renaissance. A lot of Renaissance paintings that we see, their subjects are Christian in nature, although a lot of them are not. And that's where we start to see this transition into a secular world. So I already talked about the revival of the cultural heritage of ancient Greece and Rome, and I've already talked about the recognition and importance of the individual. And society begins, note that word, begins, to make a separation from the Christian. We're talking about the Catholic Church here. The Renaissance is taking place prior to the start of the Reformation. They're going to have some overlap there. The Reformation is going to begin in the early 16th century, 1517, with Martin Luther's 95 Theses. And the Renaissance is in full swing during that time period. So there's definitely going to be some overlap there. But the Renaissance begins prior to the Reformation. And so we start to see this separation from the Catholic Church that society is making, which the Reformation is going to further. Okay. A few important individuals. We already talked about Petrarch. Another one that you should know for AP Euro is Machiavelli, Niccolo Machiavelli, who lives during the late 15th and early 16th centuries. He is a Florentine politician, and he's one of the most influential political philosophers of all time, really, certainly in Europe. So he's a diplomat in Italy, France, and Germany, and he writes one of the great political treatises in history called The Prince. He writes this in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, and it is written in 1513 is when it first appears. It's not really published for a wider audience until after his death in the 1530s, I think. And it goes on to become a sensation from when it is published. You maybe have heard the term Machiavellian thought. If you haven't, look out for that one. The more political reading you will do, the more you'll see this idea of Machiavellian thought. One of the revolutionary things about The Prince is that it is written in the vernacular, meaning it is written in Italian, not Latin. And so it is written in a language that more people can understand. And it's considered one of the first examples of modern political philosophy. Machiavelli basically said that a ruler's goal should be to get and maintain power at pretty much any cost. Machiavellian thought is very cutthroat. It's very the ends justify the means. When you get into The Prince and when you read The Prince, it's kind of some ugly stuff. You know, it's basically like a leader's goal is to either be loved or to be feared. And so if you can't be loved, you have to be feared, and vice versa. These are things that we don't really like to admit about human nature, but time and time again, Machiavellian thought has proven itself to be effective in terms of governance and in terms of political thought. And so, yeah, if it's ugly, that may be true, but politics is also ugly, and so that's Machiavelli. We could spend a lot of time talking about Machiavelli. All right, so let's talk a little bit about artistic changes brought about by the Renaissance, because this is definitely in the AP Euro curriculum. So here we have a good example of medieval art. This looks pretty, I guess, but as you can no doubt see, there's a lot of problems with this, air quotes around it, in terms of how realistic it is. It's not realistic, right? So medieval art, we're focusing on things like, take a look at facial expressions, the use of color, very vibrant, beautiful color, the amount of detail that we see, the background, the use of light and shadow. When you take all of these things together, we do not really have something that we would consider to be realistic. I mean, you just look at like the wall here, you look at the size of the individuals, how they compare. There isn't really any shadow. There's no attempt at using shadows. Background versus foreground. Look at the size of these women here compared to the wall. Like, are these like 20-foot giants compared to the trees? So there's a lot of issues here if our goal is to create something that is realistic in art. Now we contrast this with a good example of Italian Renaissance art. So this is The Marriage of the Virgin, which is one of the more famous examples of Italian Renaissance art from the early 16th century by Raphael. And I mean, you contrast this, the contrasts are so obvious to see. Yeah. So you think about all those factors we just took a look at. So the use of color. The colors are more muted. They're more realistic. These are the types of colors that we would expect to see in everyday life versus here. These gorgeous blues and reds and purples, but they're just not realistic. Much more muted colors here. Consider use of shadow. We have shadows here on the ground. So Raphael is considering where the light is coming from. Where would the sun be? This is outdoors. Contrast that with this. Is this nighttime? Is this daytime? Where is the light coming from? If it is nighttime, is it light by the moon? I mean, all of these things are not really considered. Major difference between the figures in the background, figures in the foreground. I mean, balance, proportion. There's focus on the individuals, on what they are doing, how they are standing. It's just more focus on the individual. And a really key thing here is something that I'm gonna talk a little bit more about on the next slide, is this idea of a focal point, of the vanishing point. Take a look at this painting. Where would you say the focal point of the painting is? When we're talking about the subjects, we would probably say the focal point is here, the actual marriage that is taking place. But when we consider the focal point from Raphael's perspective, the focal point is right here. All of the lines of this painting are bringing our eyes right here. If we follow the lines of the hills, for example, they're bringing our eyes right here. If we follow the lines on the ground, they're bringing our eyes right here to this focal point. Renaissance painters figured out that if you want to make something realistic, you have to have a focal point, because if you take a photograph, which of course people in the Middle Ages or Renaissance couldn't do, that photograph has a focal point. This painting does not have any kind of a focal point. There is lines going all over the place here. Renaissance art is almost always going to have this vanishing point. So another example from Raphael, the School of Athens. This isn't the best quality, but it was already annotated, which I liked. So the vanishing point right in the middle here, and all of the lines are leading to this vanishing point. And this helps with making the art more realistic. Okay, so we can trace all of these lines and see that they are all leading to this singular vanishing point. Here's a better quality image. The other thing that we need to look at when we look at Renaissance art is subject matter. So subject matter sometimes is going to be religious, but oftentimes it's going to be secular, and it's going to be calling back to ancient Greece, ancient Rome. So this is the School of Athens. So of course, this is a callback to ancient Greece. And there are many of the ancient Greek thinkers who are here. Now, all of these people were never together. They weren't even all alive together. So this is an ode to ancient Grecian thought. And when we look at these people, there are some names that we should know. Alexander the Great is back here. Socrates, Plato, Ptolemy, Aristotle. These are the great Grecian thinkers who people now in the 16th century in Italy are honoring as if they are gods, because in the secular nature of things, they are significant to the Italian thinkers. So then what can we conclude about Renaissance art? It's more realistic, especially in the use of light, shadow, and perspective. And those are the big things. And this is pretty obvious to see, but gosh, I mean, the advances are incredible. When you take a look at something like the Mona Lisa, created in 1503, and you contrast that to this painting of Frederick I from about 300 years prior, here's how I want you to look at this. So 300 years is obviously a lot of time. And it's no surprise that painters have gotten better in 300 years. But contrast the Mona Lisa with something that a painter would create today, 500 years later. It's basically the same quality. There's not too much that we look at the Mona Lisa and we say, this could be improved on in these areas. When we look at the transition from Frederick I to the Mona Lisa, we see how much has been improved on. Mona Lisa to today, not too much. And so that's why, in terms of the art world, the Renaissance is such a significant moment in time. It's this marker where the artistic community figures out a lot of things that are still being used today to make art more realistic. All right, last slide. So debates. There's a lot from a historical perspective that we need to consider about the Renaissance. First, was the Renaissance even a distinct period? Should it be considered a distinct period from the High Middle Ages? And I'm not going to answer these questions for you guys because these are debates in the historical community. We could take either side on these debates. So, did things actually get better during the Renaissance? I talked early on about how one of the problems with viewing the Renaissance as a rebirth or a revival is that it encourages us as a historical community to see the Renaissance as a good thing, air quotes around it. But we could point out the fact that if we look at the Middle Ages, people were suffering from poverty, warfare, religious and political persecution, and all these things actually increased during the Renaissance. So yeah, if we're wealthy, things are getting significantly better for us. The merchant class, for example. A little too early to talk about the middle class, but we have like a proto-middle class that's starting to emerge. For these people, yeah, stuff's getting great. But we still have this huge underclass of people who are being affected by poverty, warfare, religious, political persecution. This is what the background image is. The Renaissance, despite how it's glorified in much of the art of the time, the Renaissance is still a very violent and deadly time period. And so, is this actually better? Also, we could take a look at it from a religious perspective, and there are certainly scholars who say that because the Renaissance begins this march towards the ebbing of religious power across Europe, this is a bad thing. There are thinkers who say, religion is a good thing. Religion binds people together. Religion gives people a code to live by. And so maybe this emerging secular thought actually leads to the destruction of European morality, for example. Also, the Renaissance lessens the agency of women. Women during the Middle Ages had more agency because of the way that people lived during the Middle Ages as compared to the Renaissance. And so women, they actually take a step back in terms of the freedoms that are afforded to them during the Renaissance. Should we actually speak of a Renaissance or the Renaissance as a singular movement? It's it's very problematic. This slideshow focused on the Italian Renaissance, which is really what the College Board focuses on, but there's also a Northern Renaissance that's focusing in modern-day Belgium and the Netherlands. That's a little bit later than the Italian Renaissance. Is this a thing? Can we actually talk about the Renaissance as a thing? Or has the term become simply too loaded because it implies this positivity from a primitive Middle Ages? And so what we've seen over the last, maybe post-World War II, the last 50 to 70 years, historians are beginning to use the term early modern period rather than the Renaissance and Reformation period, which is what had been used prior to 1960s, 1970s. Now, historians are really questioning whether or not we should be using this term at all, and we should be viewing the Renaissance as a thing. So there's a lot in the Renaissance when we talk about causes, effects, debates, and significance. So that's it. Hope it helped, and we can talk more about it in class.